Okay, so this lecture is going to be in three parts. Part one is called Identity and Ideology. Part two is called Race and Signification. And part three is called The Politics of Anti-Racism. We'll have a break at an appropriate moment. Probably we'll stop at the end of each part for any questions that you might have. Okay, so this is picking up slightly on what something that Natasha said yesterday about Hall's Caribbean formation. So we'll start there by listening to a couple of things that he said about that. Here's one.
Well, my sister went to work and fell in love with a black student. The University of the West Indies had just started, and a black Barbadian student, medical student, was there, very educated, etc., but black. My mother said, no, it will not happen, not from this house, absolutely not. She forbade it. They broke it off. My sister had the most tremendous mental breakdown within 3 months. She was given shock therapy, bouts of it by ordinary GPs because there were no psychiatrists, blitzed her mind, cleared her mind of these funny ideas she'd somehow gotten hold of. And I suddenly saw that the whole macrocosm of Jamaican society and its problems and intricacies was being mirrored inside the family culture. She was the victim of colonialism. I don't know any other way of putting it. She was sacrificed to the social system.
Again, that's, I think, one of the things that's
Well,
powerful
my
about
sister
your work.
went to
I think
work.
that's one of the things that I always, is this way in which you're kind of trying to make sense of those private, understood, and not understood, both estranged and knowing close-up experiences and the wider social, cultural, political forces.
Yeah. Well, I know what you're saying, and I don't. It's not. It's again not something I try to do, but it's just how I write or how I think, etc. But I sort of know what that comes out of. It comes out of this horrendous family experience that I had, in which I came to understand that my family were living out in the interstices of the family, most private domestic space, this huge colonial drama. I mean, that is what it was about, So it was internalized into the intimate and emotionally charged theater of the family. But it had no, it wasn't that it was something else. It was the same thing on another terrain. And ever since then, I've really not been good at thinking about the distinction between, private and public, the inside and the outside, subjective interior and objective social relations. I don't quite sort of buy how that is usually written about or thought about.
No.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things to pick out here. To begin with, just some sort of historical facts. Stuart Hall's father was from the what was known in Jamaica at the time as the coloured lower middle class, with very mixed sort of ethnicity. And his mother was almost what would have been called in Jamaica a local white. So a mixed race but very pale skinned, privileged member of the middle classes, who grew up very near a plantation in a sort of rather idyllic house next to a plantation, and certainly identified with England or Britain as the kind of mother country. And when Stuart Hall was born, he recounts this family anecdote that his sister looked into the cradle and asked where they had got this black baby from. So he grew up knowing, as he said, that I was always the person in the family who was from the outside, the one who didn't fit, specifically because of the darkness of his skin within the what Natasha referred to yesterday as the pigmentocracy of Jamaican society. So beyond that sort of specific historical situation into which he was born and the way in which it played out as he's described there in his family, I think the wider point is that it gave him an approach to thought in which what is usually considered the interior or the subjective experience and the exterior or the objective experience of social relations are always confused and always in complicated ways articulating with each other. So that's why I've called this part of the lecture Identity and Ideology, because for Hall, identity is always something which we articulate from within ideology. It's not something that we can think of as just arising spontaneously within us.
Again, that's I think one of the things that's so powerful about your work, and I think that's one of.
Let's move on. There we go. Okay. So, some questions then about ideology. What are ideologies for Stuart Hall? Well, I've taken 3 points here from his essay, The Whites of Their Eyes, Racist Ideologies and the Media, from 1981. The first point is that ideologies are constructed by the articulation of different elements into a distinctive chain of meanings. So they are not kind of complete or whole things. They are different elements which are brought together into a chain of meanings, into some kind of logical or quasi-logical relation from which we can make kind of deductions. So these different elements are articulated together into a chain of meanings. Second point, ideological statements are made by individuals, but those statements are not ideological because they articulate something original. They're always made from within ideology, which is collectively constituted and part of a set of determinate social formations and conditions within which certain ideas have become naturalized. So obviously, when his sister, who's a young child at the time, looks into the cradle and says, "Where have you got this black baby from?" The reason that she's doing that is because she is articulating something from within a set of determinate social formations and conditions. It's not original. It's something which is collectively constituted by Jamaican culture at that time, but which has become naturalized to her. So she sees it as something natural. The blackness of the baby is natural, but in fact it is expressive of this set of ideas which have become naturalized. And then thirdly, and this is something which we'll come back to a number of times in this talk, ideologies construct positions of identification for their subjects from which the discourses they utter make sense. So we are always constructed within ideology in a position of identification which may or may not be the same as our position within the social formation. So we can occupy a position within ideology which is not identical to our position within a social formation, economistically or racially or whatever. Okay, so ideologies, therefore, Hall writes, work by the transformation of discourses, the disarticulation and rearticulation of ideological elements, and the transformation, the fracturing and recomposition of subjects for action. So this is what he means by sort of a position of identification. A position of identification constructs us as a subject for action. How we see ourselves and our social relations matters because it enters into and informs our actions and practices. Ideologies are therefore, he writes, the site of a distinct type of social struggle. Ideological struggle, like any other form of struggle, therefore represents an intervention in an existing field of practices and institutions, those which sustain the dominant discourses of meaning of society. So, if we're going to express or articulate a politics of anti-racism, what we will be doing for Hall in doing so is entering into ideological struggle, and therefore intervening in an existing field of practices and institutions which sustain the dominant discourses of meaning of society. So any analysis of race, racism, or anti-racism has for Hall to begin with ideological struggle and with an analysis of the existing field of practices and institutions such that we can intervene in it and turn it in a particular direction and disarticulate and rearticulate the dominant discourses of meaning of society. Okay. So some of this will be familiar from what Tony was saying yesterday about Gramsci, and I want to just draw on an essay called Gramsci's Relevance for the Study of Race and Ethnicity from 1986. And the reason for doing that is because it seems to me that there are lots of overlaps between the kind of political, more class-based analysis that Tony was going into yesterday that Hall articulates through the New Left, or with the New Left, and his slightly later approach, this essay is from the mid-80s, to questions of race and ethnicity. They have a shared foundation, and it's clearly Gramscian. And so let's just go back to a few things about Gramsci. So for Gramsci, social formations, any kind of organization of society, is complexly structured from economic, political and ideological relations which have different levels of articulation. So that is to say that the level of articulation, as he was pointing out, within the family reflects the level of articulation of the ideological relations within society at a sort of higher level, and those also relate to the economic relations of that society. So his mother coming from a plantation is obviously an economic relation, but it is related to colonial ideology, which she then rearticulates within the sphere of the family. So for Gramsci, social formations are complexly structured from relations between the economic, the political, and the ideological. And it is for Gramsci these relations of force that constitute any terrain of actual political struggle. So all political struggles are interventions into these relations of force. Gramsci's idea of hegemony is that it is a process whereby the coordination of the interests of a dominant group is achieved with the general interests of other groups and the life of the state as a whole, and that creates hegemony. So coordinating the interests of a dominant group with the interests of one or more subordinate groups and with the general interests of the state produces hegemony. The hegemony, in Gramsci's terms, of a particular historic bloc. And Gramsci is interested in analysing the ways in which what he calls the national popular, or the common sense, relates to this process of hegemonising different groups within society. And obviously this kind of takes us back to what I was saying about ideology, which is that through the process of being hegemonized, we are positioned as subjects for action in relation to the interests of groups that may not have the same actual economic interests as we have. It might be worth just pointing out here that there are two, that Gramsci articulates common sense in two different ways. This isn't something that Stuart Hall picks up on, but I think it's potentially significant. He says that common sense can refer to the sort of like received wisdom. So like what something we might read in the Daily Mail says. The kind of received wisdom of a society. So like work hard and you'll be okay, or something like that. But it can also refer to a kind of organic common sense arising from the material conditions of our life, of our working life, or our existence within ideology. So both those forms of common sense are kind of competing for what he calls the terrain of conceptions and categories on which the practical consciousness of the masses of the people is actually formed. So common sense is always changing, in that terrain. It's always shifting and changing. And what Gramsci wants us to do is to use ideological critique to break apart the hegemony of capital and articulate a new form of hegemony. So Hall takes that analysis and he applies it to the question of race, or the questions of race and ethnicity in this essay, and he basically articulates 7 kind of ways in which this perspective can shape paradigms for analysing race and racism. So the first one is that he says that we have to emphasise historical specificity, and this is something you've heard again and again, and we'll probably hear it more. So all of these different articulations of relations between the economic and the political and the ideological are always historically specific. So there's no point in trying to generalise broadly about them. We have to begin with historical specificity. He also emphasises that we need to have an emphasis on national and regional characteristics. So, for example, for Hall, the racism of Jamaican colonial society is very different from the racism experienced at the metropole by people travelling to Britain from formerly colonised countries. So Gramsci emphasises that we must concentrate on national and indeed regional characteristics, and that's something we'll come back to. He also, and this is something that Tony talked about at some length yesterday, has a non-reductionist approach to questions of the interrelations of class and race. So what I mean by non-reductionist is that neither class nor race can simply be reduced to the other. So a number of people within the New Left said to Hall, basically sort of, what's all this stuff about race in analyses like Policing the Crisis? And the reason they said that was not because they thought that race and racism weren't important, but because they assumed that race was reducible to class relations. And this is quite a common conception in the mid-20th century. So, for example, Paul Robeson, the activist and performer, went to the Soviet Union, and he came back and said basically he experienced no racism there. There was no racism in Soviet Russia. Now, obviously, we know that he was incorrect in that, but what he was expressing there was, I think, this idea that relations between races were reducible to class relations, and that if you solve class relations, relations of a racial character will kind of magically be solved as well. Or indeed the other way around. If we solve racism, then we'll solve problems of class. Gramsci takes an emphatically non-reductionist approach, so he looks at he's very interested in interrelations, and Hall is very interested in interrelations of class and race, but not in a way in which one is reducible to the other. Okay, number 4, he emphasises the non-homogeneous character of the class subject, and so for Hall this is translated across into the non-homogeneous character of the racialised subject. And we'll talk later on in this lecture about his idea of the end of the essential black subject, for example. But what he means by that basically is you can't just assume that people who are working class are homogeneous or more or less the same, that there will be a lot of differentiation between them, a lot of potential ways in which that class is split into different kinds of formations, and we need to concentrate on the heterogeneity, therefore, of the class subject and of the racialized subject. If you don't know why that would be, you just have to have a look at the current cabinet, and we can see a number of racialized subjects within it. Okay, number 5, there's a lack of assumed correspondence between economic, political and ideological dimensions. So we don't just kind of assume that because someone has a particular economic relation to the rest of the social formation, they will therefore inhabit a particular political space and particular ideological space. Brexit is an obvious example. It's an issue which clearly unified people who have very different economic relations to the rest of society under a particular ideological kind of umbrella. So if we want to understand what's happening there, we can't assume that there's a correspondence between the economic, the political, and the ideological. Gramsci also has a subtle and flexible articulation of the function of the state and civil society. So he doesn't just kind of assume that civil society and the state are the same thing, that one is just an expression of the other. So universities, for example, in some ways clearly fulfill the function of the state. You know, we're engaged in practices of bordering, for example, which are clearly doing the work of the state, but we're not in all senses always doing the work of the state. There's not this kind of there's a much more subtle and flexible analysis to be developed of the relationship between the work of the state and the work of institutions within what we might call civil society. Okay, so finally, Gramsci emphasizes the centrality of culture to social development. And what he means here is that culture is the terrain of practices, representations, languages, and customs. That's what that's what Hall means by culture. So and it's, again, it's something which was said yesterday, but culture for Hall is constitutive of politics. It establishes a terrain of practices and representations and languages and customs which make meanings which are in themselves political. They're not sort of at one step down from the political. Okay, so from Gramsci Hall takes these kind of 7 principles for approaching the study of race and ethnicity. And these are particularly important for dealing with questions about what Hall calls inferential racism. So this is again from the early 1980s, from 1981. He talks about inferential racism as those apparently naturalized representations of events and situations relating to race, whether factual or fictional, which have racist premises and propositions inscribed in them as a set of unquestioned assumptions. These enable racist statements to be formulated without ever bringing into awareness the racist predicates on which the statements are grounded. So this is clearly in the 40 years since Hall wrote that, become, I think, inarguably a more salient feature of racism, the growth of inferential, institutional, structural forms of racism, and the use of explicit racisms often as a way of avoiding questions of structural, inferential, institutional racism. We've just seen a report which effectively denied the existence of institutional racism commissioned by the government, and the way that it did that was by defining racism as a cause, a kind of prejudicial cause of inequality, rather than defining racism as the existence of inequality between groups who are differently racialized. It defined racism as the cause of those inequalities, and then said, well, we can't see that all of these inequalities are directly caused by explicit racism, and therefore racism is overstated. It's a kind of rhetorical maneuver which Hall punctures here by pointing out the significance of inferential racism, which precisely does what that report was trying to do, which is to conceal the racist predicates on which certain statements are grounded. In fact, if you look at that report, you'll see that there are lots and lots of statements within it which are clearly grounded in racist assumptions, but what the report does is, what it tries to do is to kind of invisibilize those assumptions. And that's exactly the function in Hall's analysis of inferential racism. He also, he talks about the kind of historical basis of these kinds of assumptions, these chains of racist reasoning, and he identifies 3 characteristics of racism in Britain, which are grounded historically in relations of slavery, colonial conquest, economic exploitation, and imperialism. So the first one is imagery and themes polarized around fixed relations of subordination and domination. So colonialism produces fixed relations of subordination and domination. And these fixed relations characterize racism. There's an assumption of subordination and domination built into racist thinking. The second characteristic is the existence of stereotypes grouped around the poles of superior and inferior natural species. And the third is the displacing of the language of history by the language of nature. So I just want to pause briefly on these stereotypes because in some ways they seem a little bit outdated. His references are a little bit outdated now, 40 years later. And he gives examples like the slave as a stereotype, the native as a stereotype, and the entertainer as a stereotype. But in all of those cases, he says, that although these things are kind of moving out of the present and into history, what we see is their traces moving on in the present. So the traces of the stereotype of the slave, of the native, of the entertainer, moving into the present. And he also notes, I think it's really important, that the ambivalence of all of these images, that they're not simply negative stereotypes explicitly. For example, we might see the racist stereotype of the noble savage as a kind of quote unquote positive construction of the stereotype of the native, because it articulates something that the white subject is distanced from by the process of quote unquote civilization, but it nonetheless fixes a relation of subordination and domination. So it may appear to be somehow quote unquote positive, but it fixes relations of subordination and domination, and it displaces the language of history with the language of nature. Okay, so that's what I want to say about identity and ideology and how the two interrelate. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions, and then we can move on to the second part. Okay, race and signification. This is, oops. Here we are.
A badge, a signifier, no. That we must turn, so is Appio's argument, to the realities of racial difference, to the realities, the concrete structures and realities of racial discrimination as it works itself through society in order to unlock the secret of its meaning. What we miss through our obsession with the structure of concepts is, he argues, simply reality. I better say it again because I can feel the sense of relief that after skirting around through these various discursive structures, we've come to what, after all, we all know about race. It's reality. You can see its effects. You can see it in the faces of the people around you. You can see people pulling their skirts aside as people from another racial group come into the room. You can see the operation of racial discrimination in institutions and so on. What is the need of all this scholarly hullabaloo about race when you can just turn to its reality? After all, why don't we use the evidence of our eyes? If race was such a complicated thing, why would it be so manifestly obvious to everywhere we look? Here, finally, I think at the end of a brilliant intervention by Appio, I find myself parting company. I hope not from you, or at least not yet. I have, of course, no commitment whatsoever to defending race as a concept, least of all in its genetic, biological, or scientific form, as you will see. Nevertheless, I do not understand what is meant by saying that racial discourse conceptualized as a structure of oppositions cannot be realized. Does he mean that it has no purchase on the real world, no real effects out there beyond what he calls the text world of the academy? That because we can't find a scientific referent for race, it doesn't exist? What exactly is the nature of this appeal to a manifest, simple reality? I address this point directly because I believe this is exactly where the more skeptical amongst you may be beginning to think, all right, you might say perhaps race is not, after all, a matter of genetic factors, of biology, of physiological characteristics, of the morphology of the body, not a matter of color, hair, and bone, that chilling threesome that Du Bois frequently quotes. But you may say, can you seriously be claiming that it is simply a signifier, an empty sign, that it is not fixed in its inner nature, that it cannot be secured in its meaning, that it floats in a sea of relational differences? Is that the argument that you're advancing? And isn't it not only wrong, but a trivial, and I hear the word being rustled in the audience, an idealist approach to the brute facts of human history, which after all have disfigured the lives and crippled and constrained the potentialities of literally millions of the world's dispossessed? What trail through history is more literally marked by blood and violence, by the genocide of the Middle Passage, the horrors of plantation servitude, and the hanging tree? A signifier, a discourse? Yes, that is my argument. A badge, a signal.
Okay. So, note to self: never include Stuart Hall lecturing in one of your lectures, because it just exposes how hopeless we all are by comparison. But anyway, I'm going to try to talk about what he's saying there. He's engaging with the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah and his reading of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Appiah's reading of Du Bois is effectively that although he resists the biological, genetic definition of race, it keeps returning. So this quotation from Du Bois that race persists not so much in the grosser physical differences of hair and bone, but in a common history, common laws and religions, similar habits of thought, and a certain striving together for certain ideals of life, represents an attempt to banish the genetic, biological, physiological definition of race. And Appiah effectively argues that although Du Bois makes a heroic attempt to banish them, they return in his writing. He can't quite rid himself of them, and Appiah says they must be banished forever. Now, this is now a relatively a kind of commonplace in race critical thinking, the idea of social constructionism, that races are social constructs and have no basis, as has been shown numerous times, and Hall argues there, in genetic biological reality. But Hall wants to point out this tension and work kind of with it, which is that, as he puts it beautifully, the biological definition, having been shown out the front door, tends to sidle around the veranda and climb back in through the window. This is an image he uses actually in another context, and I can't now remember exactly where, but so the idea is that that no matter how much we emphasize the social constructiveness of race, the genetic, biological, and physiological definitions of it are alive and well and remain alive and well in common sense widely. And therefore, that the we as we show them out the front door, they sidle around and come back in through the window. And but working kind of with this tension rather than banishing it, as Appiah wants to do, Hall emphasizes in Du Bois this idea of a badge or a trace. And so for Du Bois, he writes, black people have a common history. He doesn't write black people. I think he writes American Negroes. But in any case, we could refer to that as people identifying as black have a common history, have suffered a common disaster. and have one long memory of disaster. And thus the phenotypic physiological differences or apparent differences serve as a badge for the social heritage of slavery, the dissemination and insult experience. Hall picks up on this idea of the badge to make the argument that race is ultimately a matter more of language and of signification than of anything else, and that if we want to analyze it and understand it, we must analyze it discursively. So he develops a discursive concept of race in this lecture, Race, the Floating Signifier, from 1997. So just to quickly say again what discourses are for Hall. Discourses are positional. We've already kind of covered that when we were talking about ideology. Discourses construct particular positions for us to occupy. They're open systems. They're always changing. They're not sort of closed, complete systems. They are open systems, and they are formations. And actually, this is a quotation from Foucault, not from Hall. They're formations in which one can define a regularity. So, and actually, if you read Hall on discourse, what you're really doing is reading Hall, reading Foucault quite a lot of the time. So discourses are not kind of completely closed and finished systems. They're open systems, but they are nonetheless formations in which we can define some kind of regularity, in which we can find some kind of common and connected propositions. And so from that idea of what a discourse is, Hall develops what he calls the discursive concept of race. So as a third position, the first position being that sort of realist position, which is what he's articulating kind of with his tongue in his cheek there, that you just have to look out in the world and you can see that there are different races. It's perfectly obvious. So there are differences, and those differences have some kind of significance. Position number one. Position number two, which is, I guess, you might also call an essentialist position. Position number two, there are no differences. It's complete. Race is entirely a social construction. It articulates no meaningful differences at all. So that's an anti-essentialist position. And those of you who are aware of her work will hear in this the basis of Alana Lentin's recent critique of social constructionism, which I'd be happy to talk a bit more about. But I'll leave that to one side for a minute. So that's an anti-essentialist position, I guess. But Hall's position is a third position, which is he articulates like this: there's no reason to deny this reality or this diversity. So there are differences, we can see them; they're there. But it is only when these differences have been organised, so have been formed into some kind of system in which one can define a regularity. So only once these differences have been organised within language, within discourse, within systems of meaning, that the differences can be said to acquire meaning and become a factor in human culture and regulate conduct. So that is the basis or the nature of what he calls the discursive concept of race. So if we were going to push back against that, we might say, but if it's discursive, if it's just simply a question of meaning, kind of what about the, as he says, in that clip from the lecture, what about the long trail of violence that we can see in the history of race? And I'm going to pick that up, but I'm going to pick it up, I think, after we've had a little break, because we've been going for an hour. So we're going to come back to some considerations of Hall's engagement with Fanon about this question of whether or not a discursive concept of race is vanishing the seriousness, violence, horrors of the history of race. Once we've had a little, I'm going to play this extract from Isaac Julian's film Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, which will then take us to the next bit of our discussion. So Let's just share that. Okay, so I think Hall's engagement with Fanon is really important in addressing this question of why a discursive approach to the study of race is not abstract, sort of theoretical at the expense of what we would probably call today the lived experience of racism, but in fact allows us to see how violence and representation are connected in the process of racialization. So in Fanon, as Hall describes there, the important question is how the self is divided. His book is not called, as Hall points out, Black Skin, White Skin. It's called Black Skin, White Masks, because through the process of what Fanon terms epidermalization, the inscription of race on the skin of racialized people, the self becomes othered. And so the self becomes two sides within the same figure. The black man, in this case, cannot understand himself as black without occupying the position of the other, without occupying the gaze of the white man. And so he is fundamentally, violently divided from himself. So a discursive concept of race doesn't sort of vanish that violence. It actually shows us the operation of that violence in the through the realm of representation, and then and as Fanon articulates it, in the kind of psychic realm. Last section, politics of anti-racism. Let's get to that. Where are we? Slide. Right. Here we go. A little bit from the end of that lecture. Oops, where's that gone? Here we go.
Offers it to us as its symptom of appearance to stand in the place of what is in fact one of the most profound and deeply complex of the cultural systems which allow us to make a distinction between inside and outside, between us and them, between who belongs and who doesn't belong. That apparently simple, obvious, and banal fact requires the invocation of territories of knowledge in order to produce it as a simple, obvious, visible fact. In this way, race is more like sexual difference. Racial difference is more like sexual difference than it is like the other systems of difference, precisely because anatomy, physiology, appears to wind the question up. And what we know about and have learned gradually about sexual difference, that is to say, the profundity of the depth that lies behind the making of that distinction, is what we need now to begin to learn about the languages of race which we speak. I once tried to put the argument that I'm offering you in another form. I called it a critique of the idea of an essential black subject, a subject who, as it were, contained the truth within the race or the racial character of himself or herself. And what I said there was, what is at issue here is the recognition of the actual extraordinary diversity of the subjective positions and the social experiences and the cultural identities which now compose the category black. The recognition that black is essentially a politically and culturally constructed category insofar as it has meaning in human systems and insofar as it operates within the play of power. It's one which cannot be grounded in a set of fixed, transcultural, trans-historical social categories. It's one which has no guarantees in nature. And this inevitably entails a weakening or fading of the notion that race, or some composite notion of a race around the term black or color or differences of skin and hair and text, that these differences would either guarantee the effectivity of any cultural practice or determine in the end the rightness or wrongness of a political mobilization. Once you enter the politics of the end of the biological definition of race, you are plunged headlong into the only world we have, the maelstrom of a continuously contingent, unguaranteed political argument, debate, and practice. A critical politics against racism, which is always a politics of criticism. Offers it to us.
I'm just going to stop sharing for a second there to emphasize that point about a politics of anti-racism without guarantees. So Hall's point here is a subtle and very important one, I think, which is that once you accept that race cannot be grounded in fixed trans-historical categories, if you accept that, then you must accept that it is the basis for no guarantees whatsoever. And therefore the politics of anti-racism, likewise, will not be guaranteed by the terms of race. And this is what I'm just going to read it out again. This is an uncomfortable truth. It's an uncomfortable truth, of course, for those who would have liked to invoke the biological or genetic trace as a way of stopping the argument. But it's also a very difficult truth to come to terms with amongst those people who feel, as it were, the reality of race gives a kind of guarantee or underpinning to their political argument and their aesthetic judgments and their social and cultural beliefs. And of course there are forms of anti-racism that do that, just as there are forms of racism that do that. And so this observation, it seems to me, offers us an opening onto a prescription of some kind for an effective politics of anti-racism that we need to try and deduce from some of Hall's other work. So I'm going to go back to the sharing. So here, I've tried to do that in relation to an essay called Race, Articulation and Society Structured in Dominance from much earlier, so 1980, whereas Race, the Floating Signifier that we've just heard is from 1997. But nonetheless, you know, as we've said a number of times, there's a very high degree, I think, of consistency in his arguments and their bases. So it seems to me there are four things to be drawn out of this essay about what an effective form of anti-racism would be like. Number one, it must be historically specific. So he writes, in every historical moment, the mechanisms and effectivity of racism's functioning need to be demonstrated and not assumed. And of course, this is an argument against the Commission for Race and Ethnic Inequalities, that's not what they're called, I can't remember what they're called now, report, because we need to have a politics of anti-racism that demonstrates the mechanisms and the effectivity of racism's functioning. And if we don't, we leave ourselves opening to the redefinition of racism as the basis of inequality in racial prejudice, which allows people like that commission to vanish it from social formations. Number two, an effective anti-racism must be contextual. So race must not be treated as an abstraction distinct from other social relations. We have to show its articulation with different structures of the social formation. Thirdly, and I think this is absolutely crucial and probably least explicitly expressed for Hall because perhaps it was just obvious to him, but an effective anti-racism must be anti-capitalist. And this is because the practices of racism, as he writes, secure the hegemony of a dominant group over a series of subordinate ones in such a way as to dominate the whole social formation in a form favourable to the long-term development of the economic productive base. So if racism serves to secure the hegemony of a dominant group by, for example, splitting and dividing the working class against itself and into a series of subordinated class fractions who are easier to dominate in the interests of the ruling class, let's call them for the sake of brevity, then an anti-racism which is going to be effective must be anti-capitalism. It must be anti-capitalist. It must work against that project. If it doesn't work against that project, it will work by default with it, and it won't prove effective. Lastly, an effective anti-racism, and this is something which a couple of people have raised and I've deferred until now, must be committed to facilitating new oppositional forms of identity. So Hall writes, racist interpolations can become themselves the sights and stake in the ideological struggle, occupied and redefined to become the elementary forms of an oppositional formation. So interpolation obviously is Althusser's term for the kind of thing that Hall is talking about when he talks about ideology as the positioning function of ideology. So interpolation, we are brought into a particular, we are positioned in relation to a social formation in particular ways, and Hall's pointing out that process of interpolation is not just kind of given to us. It is something in which we participate, and it is therefore something that we can resist. And if it's something we can resist, then it becomes the sights and stake in the ideological struggle, and allows us to create the basis of an oppositional formation against racism. Okay. Next slide. So this is what I slightly deferred in relation to materialism, and I'll come to the question of new forms of identity that might resist the interpolation of racism in just a minute. But before that, I wanted to give you an example of an analysis of racism and a politics of anti-racism, which is grounded in material conditions. So this is from Hall's essay, Racism and Reaction. Almost all of the essays I've chosen are in this talk are either in the book Selected Writings on Race and Difference, which looks like that, or Essential Essays Volume 2, which looks like that, Identity and Diaspora, that's edited by David Morley. But this one is not, it's from Selected Political Writings, this book here, so that's where the page references to. And it's an analysis of British racism. And he concludes it by saying this: I want to insist that racism is not a set of false pleas which swim around in the head. They're not a set of mistaken perceptions. They arise because of the real material conditions of existence. They arise because of the concrete problems of different classes and groups in the society. Racism represents the attempt ideologically to construct those conditions, contradictions and problems in such a way that they can be dealt with and deflected, that's a typo there, sorry, in the same moment. So racism constructs real material conditions, contradictions and problems so that they can be both dealt with and deflected in the same moment. And he illustrates that by an analysis of, which I don't really have time to sort of take you through in detail now, it's all in that essay, of the sites of race riots from Notting Hill in 1958 through the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s. Not into the early 80s, he stops in the 70s, sorry. And he talks about why such and such a riot took place in Notting Hill as opposed to in a more established, settled community like Brixton, and then why they spread to different places. Now, the reasons for this are, he says, because of real material conditions of existence within the working class. Now, of course, this argument has been appropriated by the right, and we've had a lot of analyses of Brexit and Trump and so on, which have been predicated on the left behind white working class. And I want to just emphasise that that is not what Hall is advocating for here. But he is advocating for understanding the material conditions and concrete problems that give rise, in a much more detailed and indeed accurate way than that argument could ever manage, that give rise to opportunities for racism to grasp them, as in the case of Brexit, ideologically, and therefore deal with the contradictions and problems and deflect them at the same moment by ascribing them to the problem of race. Okay, so anti-racism must be rooted in an analysis of material conditions. But also, as I said before, it needs to be committed to the formation of new subjects. And he has two essays with the term new ethnicities in the title: Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities, and the more famous New Ethnicities. Now, he talked at the end of that lecture about the end of the essential black subject, by which he means that as he writes here, black is not a question of pigmentation. The black I am talking about is a historical category, a political category, a cultural category. And he writes that, crucially, that category, that form of subjectivity arises out of struggle. So in the very struggle, in the moment of grasping this this abjected category of black, arises a change of consciousness, a change of self-recognition, and a new process of identification, the emergence into visibility of a new subject. A subject that was always there, but was emerging historically. And indeed, he talks about, in a kind of personal frame, talks about the recognition of himself as black at that moment. And I would say that this kind of commitment to the formation of new ethnicities, and something I was talking about when Ahmed asked a question earlier on, is really rooted in his commitment to what he calls vernacular cosmopolitanism. So the cosmopolitanism fundamentally of a multiracial working class, not the cosmopolitanism, as he says, of businessmen in suits flying around the world and sampling a bit of this culture and sampling a bit of that culture, but the rooted cosmopolitanism of multiracial working class communities, formed through processes of globalization. And he has a clear commitment stated to what he calls globalization from below. So the migration of peoples, because of the processes of globalization from above, so because of the sort of neoliberal hegemony, and its form of globalization creates this sort of movements of peoples from below, and he has a deep, I think, personal and political commitment to that process, and to the ways in which it gives rise to what he calls vernacular cosmopolitanism, and to the subjectivities and new ethnicities that it generates. And so this process is what he's describing here, where he writes, cultural identities come from somewhere, they have histories, but they also undergo constant transformation. Far from being grounded in a mere recovery of the past, which is waiting to be found, and which, when found, will secure our sense of ourselves into eternity, identities are the names we give to the different ways we're positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past. So again, there's another commitment here to his own experience of diasporic formation. And this carries over into his idea of new ethnicities, and indeed into his analysis of multiculturalism and its kind of problems and opportunities, which goes through the 90s and into the 2000s. And I wanted to just note this particular articulation of it, where he says, we're beginning to think about how to represent a non-coercive and a more diverse conception of ethnicity to set against the embattled hegemonic conception of Englishness, which under Thatcherism stabilises so much of the dominant political and cultural discourses, and which, because it is hegemonic, does not represent itself as an ethnicity at all. So he talks about the ways in which ethnicity, as a kind of process of cultural self-recognition, which is always kind of being transformed and remade, the ways in which that has been effectively colonised by the state, and so we get a form of hegemonically white Englishness under Thatcherism, for example. And of course it's something which we've seen has been resurgent since at least 2015, very strongly, but has always been there in the past. If you look at New Labour's record on migration, for example. So he wants to effectively liberate ethnicity from this kind of nationalist, imperial formation, and try to engage what he calls a non-coercive and more diverse conception of it. I want to just note here that a lot of this work is rooted, strangely enough, to my kind of mind anyway, in a reading of Derrida, who I think in the English or Anglophone academy we tend to think of as a fairly kind of liberal, depoliticized figure, and Hall is very engaged in his idea of différance and the idea of which blends difference with something being deferred, so endlessly put off. I'm sure you'll know this, but that conception of difference resists closure in binarized forms of opposition, so us against them, which obviously is fundamental to the logic of race and the operation of racism. It points out that there is always a contingent, ongoing, transformative flow, and that to fix that at any point, to articulate it and fix it at any point, is always arbitrary. And it's always sort of an arbitrary cut into the contingent flow of difference. And Hall critiques the kind of disciples of Derrida who have turned his work into a kind of a focus on sort of formal playfulness evacuated of any political meaning, and tries to activate this idea for a much more deeply politicized understanding of how identities and ethnicities are developed. So, and he wants to take this into an articulation of ethnicity rooted in equality and indifference. So he writes in The Multicultural Question in 2000, how to combine the claims of equality, justice, and the recognition of difference in such a way that none of these factors trumps or neutralizes the other is, of course, an extremely difficult question. And I think, to be honest, that's probably the question that I want to leave us to contemplate in discussion for the last 20 minutes. How we combine the claims of equality, justice, and the recognition of difference in such a way that none of these factors trumps or neutralizes the other. The only thing I might just return us very quickly to that idea of showing the biological definition of race out the front door and it's sidling around the veranda and coming back in through the window. There's a danger here, for example, that kind of liberal equality is shown out the front door with the conception of difference, and then it sidles around the veranda and creeps back in through the window. And the only way that we can resolve this question is a sort of liberal understanding of the equality of individuals. That would be, of course, to trump difference with equality. So that's Hall's reading of the problem of liberalism and the fundamental flaw of liberal anti-racism. But I'm now edging into what I think rather than what Stuart Hall thinks. So I'm going to stop there and ask you if you have any questions.